Hi, everyone. My name is Dakota Russell. I'm the Executive Director of the Hard Mountain Wyoming Foundation. And it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome you to our second week of online programming from Hard Mountain. As many of you have no doubt heard, Hard Mountain Interpretive Center has closed due to concerns about the COVID-19 coronavirus. But we are committed to telling these stories and to getting this history out there in any way that we possibly can. And so for the duration of this crisis, we are going to be joining you here online on a regular basis, and I hope that you'll be joining us as well. This week, we want to talk about something that is kind of an unexpected legacy of Hard Mountain, especially here locally within the Wyoming community. And it's not something that you would think about being a long-lasting memory of the camp. But perhaps there is nothing so remembered here locally as the camp's agricultural program. Now, part of the reason why this has become legendary is, of course, because this ag program was the very first in the area. In between Cody and Powell was still high desert at the outset of the war. It had never been irrigated, water had never been brought here, nobody had attempted to plant it. And so the incarcerated Japanese Americans were really the very first to break ground out here. But the second reason that it is so legendary is that it defied all the odds. Nobody thought that given the window and given the resources that the Japanese Americans had to build this agriculture program, they would actually be able to make it successful and to make it something that could feed the camp. And so locally, it even became known as the Hard Mountain Miracle. That's how little anybody had ever expected this to succeed. So I want to talk to you just a little bit today, kind of provide you a general overview of what the program was about and how it got started. First off, I think it's important that we cover why an agricultural program was necessary at the camp. When I float this question out to audiences, the most common answer I get back is that it was necessary because the food was just so terrible. And that's not a wrong answer. It's not the whole answer, as we'll get into in a moment, but it's not a wrong answer at all, especially in the early days of the camp when Japanese Americans started arriving in the fall of 1942. The food was supplied to the camp by the Army Quartermaster Corps, which, as you can imagine, had other things on its mind with the war going on, and so the camps kind of became an afterthought. Nonetheless, supply trains did keep running regularly to the camp, but the problem was they ran out of Denver and sometimes as far away as Kansas City. So there could be a long lag between the time they loaded those foodstuffs up on the train and the time it actually made it to Wyoming there. Any fresh produce that they sent was generally well on to rotted by the time that it got here. And there wasn't much protein, much fresh meat that could survive that trip either. And so what they did wind up getting in Hard Mountain was a lot of canned goods, a lot of frozen supplies, and a lot of stuff that didn't spoil easily. And so that meant for protein, generally you had hot dogs. People say they could show up on Hard Mountain tables, 2 to 3 times a week and at any meal. The other protein that was plentiful was a frozen fish, which was known about camp as the Mississippi mud skipper, sort of a mystery meat item there. And there is an urban legend from camp that somebody at one point was unpacking a bunch of Mississippi mud skipper, opened one of the packages, and saw World War I rations printed on it. So this was generally pretty detested by everyone within the camp. And so it really was canned goods and very processed stuff or deeply frozen stuff of unknown pedigree there that people were being fed. As you can see in this picture, the Japanese Americans incarcerated at the camp were fed in these sort of communal mess halls. There was were two of these on each block. So each of these mess halls served about 250 people 3 times a day. And the cooks didn't necessarily have a whole lot of cooking experience. It wasn't really required to get a job as a cook there. And so that could contribute to the problems as well. Another problem that happened was that the US government did not understand the typical Japanese American diet. And so they were throwing bread and potatoes, which happened to be really cheap, at them, 3 times a day sometimes. But they had never managed to secure, say, a rice contract that would allow rice to come into the camps. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction with that as well. But all of that said, this doesn't become the primary reason that Heart Mountain decides it needs to start an agriculture program. That actually has a lot more to do with this guy right here. Who we're looking at right here is Congressman Martin Dies of Texas. Dies is in charge of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which you guys probably know as the committee that drums up a lot of paranoia about communism. But actually during the war, wound up targeting Japanese Americans pretty heavily too. In the mind of Dies and a lot of his fellow politicians in Washington, it wasn't enough to remove the Japanese Americans from their homes and to send them to these camps. They felt that even though there was no evidence of Japanese American espionage or sabotage or even widespread loyalty toward Japan in the community, that these people, just because they were of Japanese ancestry, needed to be punished. And so there was a general belief that, even having them live a regular standard of living inside of the camps was too good, that they were being coddled inside of there. And Dies set out to find evidence of this. And he found it, or what he believed to be it, at Heart Mountain. You see, early on in the camp's existence, the editor of the Denver Post, who had a lot of the same sort of leanings and conspiracy theories as Dies here did, actually sent a reporter up to do a so-called expose on the camps. And this reporter wound up coming out to Heart Mountain, but also not paying much attention to anything that he saw out there, preferring instead to get the rumors that were going around Cody and Powell about what was happening inside of the camp. As project director Guy Robertson said sarcastically at the time, this reporter made a full and complete survey of everything happening in the camp, most of it, though, from his bar stool in the Aramark Hotel in Cody. And so the one person that this reporter does talk with extensively is a guy by the name of Earl Best. Earl Best had been part of the white staff at Heart Mountain and had served as a mess hall steward. After a series of disciplinary actions, Best had finally been fired and was pretty disgruntled about it and really telling it to anybody who would listen to him. And so when this reporter started paying attention to him, Best came up with all of these stories about how there was no food rationing at Heart Mountain as there was everywhere else in the United States at this point. How there was massive hordes of food that had been stuffed away everywhere, that the quartermaster's corps was just sending trains after trains full of food. He went so far as to say that there were mess hall attics that were entirely full of hams in Heart Mountain, just making up these wild and unbelievable stories. But the reporter ate them up. It was exactly what his editor was looking for. And so he took all of that information back home and wrote this series of articles supposedly exposing how the Japanese Americans were being pampered inside of Heart Mountain. And the Dies committee latched onto this pretty hard. And they use this as their basis for saying, we can't be offering the Japanese Americans a free ride up here. And in short, here's what they say: produce or face food shortage. In other words, several of these politicians out in Washington were willing to let Japanese Americans starve to death inside of the camps if they did not start raising their own food. And so you can see that the stakes here just aren't about the food in the mess holes being nasty. The stakes here were actually life or death. As far as anyone within the camp knew, their food supply could be cut off at any moment. And so that was the real driving force and the real impetus behind the creation of the agriculture program. So let's talk about whose shoulders onto which all of this responsibility falls. First off, we have our two Caucasian department heads right here. That's Glenn Hartman that you see in the sketch over there. That's a sketch that appeared in the Heart Mountain Sentinel newspaper by Issei artist Jack Yamasaki. And then next door to him, right there, we have a photo of Alden Ingram, who was the assistant department head. Both of these guys were Wyoming natives. Both of them had spent time with the University of Wyoming at their experimental farm. And so we're open to challenges and to new ideas. Most importantly, Hartman credited his success to, not thinking that he was always the smartest guy in the room. He was a very humble guy and understood that taking into account other opinions, even if those opinions came from Japanese American incarcerees, was in his best interest, because sometimes there might be a better idea than his. And so pretty quickly, the two guys right here meet up with two gentlemen who came to the camp very early on and who really had an extensive background in agriculture and were able to help. The first there, posing in the field with that crop of melons right there, is James O. Ito. Ito had been a farmer all his life in the Los Angeles area. He'd grown up on a farm, and as he got older, his parents actually moved into the city and had a whole network of vegetable stands across LA there. And then next door to him there, counting the potatoes down in the cellar, is Aichi Sakawe. And Sakawe was sort of the numbers guy on the Heart Mountain operation. Obviously a great farmer. He'd come from a pear orchard in San Jose, but he was also a great statistician. And when you think about it, there were a lot of statistics involved with this. We are talking about needing a program that can feed nearly 11,000 people. And Sakawe has to figure out exactly how much produce is going to be needed, what kind of yields they're getting from each field there. And so his opinion becomes invaluable as well. And so these four men are really tasked with designing what an agricultural program in this area that has never had any agriculture whatsoever is going to look like. And so they've got quite a few challenges in front of them here. First off, let's just talk a little bit about the land that we're looking at right here. So Heart Mountain sits up in the high desert. That means that very little actually grows here except for sagebrush and prickly pear cactus. It is exceedingly dry. Now, there had been a canal cut from the Shoshone River, which you're seeing in the foreground there, out to water fields outside of Cody, and then a little further up north around Powell there. But in the area in between, no canal had been cut out there. They had actually started on one in the 1930s. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, had actually started to cut one and gotten several miles coming from the Buffalo Bill Reservoir west of Cody out toward Heart Mountain. But when they were about a mile and a half away and hadn't actually even waterproofed any of it, the war started and the CCC was basically disbanded when young men went off to serve there. And so that was left incomplete at the start of this. Now, another challenge that is going to come into play at Heart Mountain is that we're the furthest north of the camps. That means that we have the shortest growing season. Generally, in 1942, it was considered to be about 90 to 100 days that they As you can imagine, this is a challenge, especially for farmers from California who are used to a much longer and less challenging growing season. And so there are problems that are going to need to be resolved if this is a success. And as these four men sit down to lay out a plan in the fall of 1942, they decide to break up the work in between them. And so Ingram over here gets assigned the job of equipment. He is to look around locally and try and buy up as many farm implements as he possibly can to serve the camp. And he also is in charge of securing a contract for 100 Ford tractors that are going to be put into use in plowing these fields around the camp. James Ito is in charge of figuring out exactly where they're going to farm at. Ito actually had a degree in soil science and still had contacts back on the West Coast that could run soil samples for him. And so with special permission of the project director, he was the first man to ever be allowed to go outside of the confines of the barbed wire. So he could walk this 20,000 acre project and try and pick where they were going to put the fields. So he takes a number of samples over the course of the next few months and sends them off to the West Coast to see which is best candidates for growing food there. In the meantime, Sakawe is charged with finding seeds. This turns out to be something that they could solve almost completely within the camp there. As Sakawe starts making inquiries around, he figures out that among the incarcerees, there are several seed dealers from the West Coast. Prime among them, Kumezo Hachimanji. And Hachimanji had a seed store on the West Coast that he had shuttered right before he left, and he had put all of his seed stock into storage. And so Sakawe connects with him, gets permission to have all of these seeds brought out from California out here to Heart Mountain. Now, that's not the only source of seeds, though. He actually also finds a local family who's willing to volunteer to help. The Kawano family had moved to northwest Wyoming in the 1930s. Now, because they lived east of the line of exclusion, so they weren't directly on the West Coast, even though they were of Japanese heritage, they didn't have to go to the camps. They were allowed to stay on their farm for the duration of the war. But they wanted to do something to help, and so they wound up donating a good portion of their seed stock to get Heart Mountain started in the early days there. So that's what these two guys are working on. Let's go back to Glenn Hartman here, though, because he's going to give himself the most absolute urgent job. And that is to figure out how they are going to get water out here to these fields. And so that means finishing the canal. And so Hartman very quickly gets a crew of people to help him out, mostly made up of Japanese American incarcerees, very few white staff members on this crew. But they head out to go to work with bulldozers and shovels to cut the rest of this canal. Again, we've got about 1.5 miles that needs to be finished right there. Then we've got to go almost 7 miles of waterproofing with bentonite that needs to be done on the existing canal. And then, of course, we have to cut all of the smaller ditches and laterals off of this to actually feed the fields here. So it is a major, major job. And so they set to work as soon as they possibly can, as soon as they develop a plan. And in that first fall of 1942, they work right up until Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve is the day that the ground is frozen too hard for them to continue. And they know that they're going to have to stop for the duration of the winter. By the way, in this picture, as I said, we can see the Shoshone River in the foreground. We're seeing where the Heart Mountain fields eventually wound up in the foreground here too. About 1,400 acres there that they put into agriculture. And then you can sort of see in the background, right in front of Heart Mountain there, the roofs of the barracks where the camp was actually located. And right off to kind of the right side of the frame there, you can see the chimney to the hospital. So For the winter, everybody sort of has to go back into planning mode and starting to make preparations for spring. But as soon as they can possibly get out into the fields, while Hartman's crew resumes work on cutting the canal, Ito and Sakawe head out here to start plowing these fields. And so they hire a good number of tractor drivers to help them out using the tractors that Ingram has got for them. The problem that they arrive at as soon as the season starts to wear on, though, is that the government has suddenly decided to allow Japanese Americans outside of the camp on work permits. You know, at first, most of them going locally to help out on sugar beet farms around there, to help out with local harvests or regional harvests, some of them going out to Idaho and Montana as well, but eventually expanding that to where they're allowed to go into the Midwest on work permits as well. And so they are losing most of the hardworking, able-bodied men in the camp. And so their core of tractor drivers pretty quickly becomes, you know, very female and very young, you know, a lot of them teenage kids that are winding up in here. But nonetheless, they continue to go on trying to till these fields for the very first time, right? You got to remember, this is hard, dry ground that they are working in that has never seen a plow before. And so it's a very tough task, and they quickly find out that these little Ford tractors that Ingram has bought them are not up to the task. Sakawe, in a moment of desperation, even borrows one of the bulldozers from the canal project to see if he can't get it to cut into this ground. But it's unsuccessful too, and there are huge complaints about needing better equipment. And this is the one area where Hartman and Ingram wind up on one side and Ito and Sakawe wind up on another. For most of the time, they work as a team. But this one, they're going to be split because Ito and Sakawe stand with the workers. They say, no, you have to get them better equipment if you expect them to do this work. Hartman and Ingram say, no, it's fine. The equipment that they've got should work. This comes to a head in an eventual labor strike. Finally, the tractor drivers just say, no more. If you're not going to give us better equipment, we're not going to do this anymore. And so Ingram and Hartman say to them, that's fine. You know, we'll get somebody who will do it. So they go to the high school, find a bunch of ne'er-do-well young men to come out and drive the tractors around with no supervision. And according to Sakawe, after about a day of that, they were ready to give in to the strikers' demands and buy some new equipment there. So there were a lot of problems early on in this, and it was a very stressful time. Another issue that came up was that the tractor drivers started their day at 6 a.m. The white workers in the motor pool wouldn't give them the keys to the area to get into the gas tanks there. And the motor pool workers didn't start work until 9 in the morning. And so frequently the tractor drivers would run out of gas in the middle of the day and have to walk back to the camp. At one point that came to a head, and actually the tractor drivers surrounded the motor pool garage, and the administration thought they were going to have a full-scale riot in camp on their hands before it was fortunately resolved. So tensions ran high early on in this project, as you can imagine with anything this stressful going on. Now, we come to the issue of how they are going to deal with this shortened growing season. And luckily, they have at their disposal a core of people they didn't realize were going to be a huge asset to them. Most of the people at Heart Mountain came from Los Angeles or the San Jose area. So most of them coming from California, again, where the growing season was quite a bit longer. But about 1,000 people from the Yakima Valley of Washington, who had originally been slated to go to the Minidoka camp in Idaho, wound up at the last minute getting rerouted and sent to Heart Mountain. Most of these families were farming families, and because they were up further north, they had a little more experience in managing a shortened growing season. And so they were able to bring some ideas to the table that the California farmers had never thought of. The first one was what you see right here, these hotbeds. So these are basically wooden structures that they built up, and once they had got these built up, they put sort of a glass sheet, a sort of hinged roof that would go on top of them. And these were where they would actually start the plants. They sat along a slope in the camp that got maximum sunlight right there. And so the sun could come in and heat up the plants, but they'd also be protected from the snow or the rain and the cold temperatures as well inside of here. So these little mini greenhouses that they built that they could start plants in before putting them out in the field. And that provided them with a few extra weeks to grow there. Another thing that the Washington farmers recommended was these hot caps. These are little wax paper coverings that once the young plants got out into the field, they would sort of fix to the top of them right there. And this would provide them with, you know, a week or two more of sort of an insulated covering in case things were to suddenly take a turn and things were to freeze or get really, really cold. These hot caps would help to keep the young plants from dying right there. The two innovations that they brought there that were probably in large part responsible for the success of this program in its first year. Now, running parallel to all of this, you actually also had a plan for meat at Heart Mountain and eggs as well. To the northern side of the project, you had this hog and chicken farm that was getting set up over there. They had originally contemplated cattle as well, but the logistics of it just never worked out quite right, and so they never had more than a few cattle at a time there. But they had large numbers of hogs and chickens. The two guys who this fell to were Satoru Saijo and Marizo Nakagawa. And these two gentlemen were, again, experienced farmers. Nakagawa had been a hog farmer out on the West Coast, and Saijo had a successful chicken farming operation with his family there. The buildings for building all of the hog barns and chicken coops were actually old CCC buildings that they had moved in all the way from Yellowstone National Park and brought out here and sort of reconfigured them into chicken coops and hog barns and everything else that they needed there. Saijo largely kept his crew working on the chicken project among his own family there. That meant his wife and then his two sons, Gompers and Albert Saijo, both of whom would not go on to be known as great farmers, but would eventually be known as great poets. But at this time, they were working on the chicken farm. Saijo had his reasons for wanting to keep it in the family there. He discovered early on when he got a bunch of helpers from within the population of the camp that suddenly he had an outbreak of illness among his chickens, what was known around Heart Mountain as barrack sickness. So apparently these chickens would get very, very sick, and the workers would have to carry them away to the barracks to take care of them there. Curiously, no chicken ever recovered from barrack sickness. They just sort of disappeared forever. And so Saijo, angry at the obvious theft going on under his nose right here, chose to keep his crew of people he could trust. Now, back at the produce area, they had a similar issue that was happening. By early May and June, they were starting to get some of the first crops coming up. Melons were one of the first things to grow in, those that you saw James Zito posing with out in the field. What wound up happening was as soon as they got ripe overnight, they all disappeared from the field before anybody could come out and harvest them, and were taken away to the barracks by different individuals. And so it very much frustrated Ito there. But The harvest continued. They were starting to get in the spring of 43 there. The first plants started to come up. They were starting to actually have the first vegetables, but they also knew that it was approaching summer and things were going to dry out very quickly. By the 1st of June, there still was no irrigation out there. The water was not yet flowing. And then there was another threat that happened. Early June, also, there was a freak snowstorm that threatened to destroy the crop. But luckily, the damage was kept to a minimum. And actually, Glenn Hartman eventually said that probably it was a good thing because the snow melted really quickly and provided them with some much needed water while they were still waiting for his crew to finish cutting the canal. But eventually, as you can see in this photo, the ditches were cut and the water started to run into the fields in the middle of June, right in the nick of time there for the dry season to get started. And so they were able to irrigate the fields and get them going. And things started to look up. I always say that it's evidenced best by a guy by the name of Shishiro Hosono, who was in charge of the dry bean fields. And Hosono, right after the water started running, said that his beans were doing great, that he was going to produce super high yields, and that he was going to grow enough beans that come fall, he would be the most hated man in all of the camp. And even as these beans were starting to grow, even as we hit the middle of summer, the first round of vegetables were already needing to be harvested there. And this really became quickly much more than anybody just within the agriculture program could do. In fact, this pretty much required the assistance of the entire camp to work on. And so they would call for volunteers to come out and harvest and process food. Some of it, of course, needed canned up. Some of it needed pickled that they were getting out of there, like the daikon radishes. And some of it just needed to be made ready to store there. And so they recruited as many people as they possibly could. People would come from every block to pitch in for a little while. In the center of this photo, you see Virgil Payne, who's the head of the social welfare department, pitching in, harvesting vegetables. In the summertime, a lot of the high schoolers helped out with it. Once school started again, the principal kind of cracked down on that and made it so that that was much harder to do. But it really became a community effort. Everybody understood that the success of this farm depended on their efforts. And so they all came out in full force. And so throughout the entire summer, you have all sorts of volunteers who are working on the farm project, who are getting the harvest in. And by September, as it's starting to get cold, most of it is coming in. It gets a little stressful again because everybody knows that any time now that cold snap could hit and everything could be frozen. But they managed to get everything in eventually. Over the summer of 1943, the engineering department in the camp had designed 2 long cellars, about 300 feet long, each of them, that were going to hold all of the produce coming out of these fields. And these are magnificent structures. We're actually going to take you guys down into one of them come Friday here. But these were designed to hold all of the necessary produce for the camp once it started coming out there. So these cellars were gradually getting filled up. Finally, by the end of September, the only thing left in the ground was 1 field of rutabagas, which rutabagas grew great at Heart Mountain. They had tons of rutabagas. The problem was that nobody liked rutabagas. And so finally, the directors of the ag program just decided to leave the rutabagas to wither in the fields. But they managed to get everything else in and stored in the cellars to where it could feed them for the rest of the year. In the end, according to Sakawe's numbers, the Heart Mountain Ag Department and volunteers grew over 52 different types of vegetables in these fields, including Japanese vegetables like daikon, gobo, cabbage. And they also wound up putting over 1,400 acres under plow. All in all, at the end of the season, Sakawe said they had 2,069,735 pounds of vegetables. There were no food shortages in Heart Mountain that year and any of the years to follow. After the first year was finished, James Ito wound up taking a job with the government, going and working on a government farm on the East Coast eventually before joining the Army. And he left the ag program in the care of Sakawe. They had a successful next season and actually put even more ground under plow and raised even more vegetables. And then in the 45 season, it became clear that the camp was going to be closing and that there wasn't a need for an ag program anymore. And so they wound up contracting out the fields and getting in produce from local farmers in order to feed the camp there. But actually in that intervening year, that second year, they produced enough produce that they actually had a surplus at Heart Mountain. They weren't allowed to compete with local farmers and sell it out in the local community, so they wound up shipping it off to some of the other camps whose agriculture program wasn't doing as well. And so it really was a miracle, which is what it was called when James Ito and Eiichi Sakawe came back when the Interpretive Center was first opened. When they came back for the grand opening, they were shocked to find that this was no longer a high desert. Everything between Cody and Val was now planted, and it was now vibrant green. It was growing out there. And they were shocked even more when local farmers came up to them and told them how the example that they had set of how this land could be used to grow such a diversity of crops, how problems that people had thought were unsolvable could be solved. Then that's what had inspired the farmers that came after the Japanese Americans to continue to work this land. And so they saw it as a miracle. Now, I don't think that Ito and Sakawe, they were pragmatists. I think they would have said that there was too much hard work in there for it to be just a miracle. But I think the real miracle is the way that everyone pitched in together and understood that this was necessary for the survival of the camp, and that everyone was going to have to help out with it. And so in a way, this agriculture program not only affected the history of the Bighorn Basin from here on out, but it also had a huge effect in turning the people of Heart Mountain from a displaced and in some cases hopeless people into a functioning community that determined that they were going to make it for themselves. And so perhaps that's the true miracle there. Thanks for joining this week. I will definitely be down in the comments to answer any questions you guys might have about the Heart Mountain Agriculture Program. And continue to stay tuned in for future programs we have in the days to come. Thanks so much.